Eleni Basten. I'm the director of the International Studies Institute. And this is one of the lectures in the fall semester's lecture series with the overarching theme, Peace from Conflict to Reconciliation. And I'm very thankful to colleagues from here, from other states in the US and from abroad who came and participated in our ongoing program this semester. Today I am more than honored and happy to have our local expert, Dr. Emile Nakhleh, discuss the Arab Spring from many different perspectives. And Mark Pisanic, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, will be introducing our speaker and will also be the commentator. And for people who are new to our series, this is also offered as a class this semester. Students who signed up get 2 credits. They had to come to every presentation, which I think is more of a treat than a chore, and write some essays also. So that's the explanation for the student sign-up sheet that is going around. So all yours, so thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here to introduce my friend Emile Nakhleh. And of course, we are all here at a particularly sad time. It's in the context of the attacks in Paris and Lebanon, and not that far after the plane was attacked in Sinai. And it's at times like this that an entirely natural human reaction is to circle the wagons, to embrace the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, as a way of responding to a very difficult and complex situation. And it's at this particular kind of time, in the wake of these kinds of attacks, that we need people who are able to understand that, but also understand deeply the region where these crises are taking place, the international context, and to think through, bless you, to think through how, it's a very appropriate ring for our topic. But it's especially at times like this that we need to take a deep breath, take a step back, and think critically about how we should understand these events and how the international community in the United States should respond. And Emile Nakhleh is ideally suited to be exactly the person you would like to listen to and converse with in trying to understand these things because, well, first and foremost, he has degrees in political science and international relations, and as a political scientist who studies international relations, I have to, appreciate the degrees from Georgetown and American University. Also someone who had the misfortune of being a department chair in the political science department at Mount St. Mary's for many years, which prepares you for lots of dangerous activities. But someone who understands deeply the academic literature in the international politics of the region, American foreign policy, and the politics of the Middle East, but also has spent many years in government service in the Central Intelligence Agency, and his final position before retiring was the head of the political Islam section in the CIA. And his job there was to educate policymakers who didn't understand the region very well, to provide them unbiased advice and information so that they could make better policy decisions. Well, or at least to provide them the advice that would allow them to make better policy decisions should they choose to take the advice and reflect on the information. And especially in this context, the fact that he has also been one of the strongest advocates for embracing our democratic tradition and embracing democracy as a solution to many political problems within nations and in the international system is why we need to reflect on that particular theme today, because it would be so easy for the United States or other governments to say, maybe Assad is not such a bad guy after all. Maybe we should bind ourselves more tightly with Russia in a joint project to fight terrorism in this region. And you know, the one book of the many books that Emile has authored that I read, The Necessary Engagement, made a rational, thoughtful, strong argument that if the United States was going to succeed for the long term in the Middle East, it needed to embrace democracy and democratization in that region. And that meant understanding and engaging with people running in elections who probably disagreed with the vast majority of the things that the United States had done in the region for the previous several decades. And therefore, you know, in that context, he is the perfect person to reflect on the tremendous missed opportunities of the Arab Spring, and I hope a little bit reflecting on how we can respond to the crisis today in that context. So thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, very much for these kind remarks. The first person I met at UNM when we moved from the Washington, D.C. area to Albuquerque was Mark Peasney and another professor from political science, and we had lunch, and so we started talking, and that was several years back, and the friendship continued. I not only consider Mark a dear friend, but I value him. When I got to know him, he was a department chair here in political science. He asked me if I could teach. I said, no, been there, done that. Then I followed his career as he became Dean of Arts and Sciences, which is the largest college at the university. And I have worked closely with him even on this project, the National Security Initiative, which I have been coordinating at UNM. In fact, I'm kind of dressed elegantly now is because I briefed the Board of Regents this morning. So I came from that briefing to this lecture. So what I would, the one point that Mark did not mention about my background, which I will talk about in a minute, is that I'm a Catholic boy from Nazareth, and so when I was briefing one president about political Islam, he was kind of concerned about the fate of the Christians in the Middle East. So he said, well, what do Christians in the Middle East do? And I really didn't want to give him a whole lecture. So I said, well, Mr. President, they come here and become experts in Islam. So he got that. And when I went to, so briefly, before I go in, somebody alerted me to the subtitle, Must Interests Always Trump Values? The values are the democratic values that Mark was talking about. The interests are the national interests. So somebody asked me whether that word refers to a presidential candidate. So nope, it's a disclaimer, has nothing to do with the presidential candidate, that word. But so the question is, when we talk about these tragedies in the Middle East in the last, and in Africa today, of course, regarding terrorism and violence and murders and so on, what kind of sense can we make out of it? And remember, we are not Mauritania or Chad or the Dominican Republic. We are the sole superpower in the world. So therefore, the responsibilities and privileges that go with that status are something unique. And so the presentation is going to be in the context of that. The subtitle tells it all. must interests always trump values. Now, I put that right from the beginning, though I want to say this is really a straw man. It's not a correct dichotomy, but I just wanted to put it up for an academic discussion that we are having today. Briefly, I was in academia, as Mark indicated. I made the migration to government, which was a phenomenal experience. I honestly believe and wish more senior professors go to government after they become senior professors with established expertise, because then they can bring in their expertise to government, and they benefit themselves, they would learn, they benefit their audience because of their expertise, and honestly, and very crassly, they don't have to worry about their careers because they come in at a certain high level. I mean, when I started in the government, I think I told Mark this story. I went to HR and asked her, what's this GS business? Oh, she said, you know, GS1, GS2. I said, how high does it go? She said, GS15. I said, I take that. And then she said, there are steps, 15.1, 15.2, 15.3. I said, how high does it go? She said, 15.10. I said, I take that. So I started in government 15.10, which is the highest of the GS scale. And that's important because then if you want to speak truth to power, this is an important thing to have. You don't have really to worry about your career or your promotion or advantages that you might gain or lose as a result of that. So my experience in the government was very, very rewarding. And it was really hard to leave, but I always say it's always good to leave at a high note rather than to go outstanding rather than horizontally or being pushed out of that office. And here I have been involved with looking at all the rich programs that UNM has that relate to national security broadly defined. And so the briefing I gave the regents today was about the possible establishment of a university-wide institute, which would be called a Global and National Security Policy Institute, that will be representing the whole university. So I want to stay to the presentation very briefly will be a few key observations about the region and terrorism. One presentation about a slide about the Middle East, a status report where the Middle East is today. 5 key judgments. After that, if you don't want to stay, you can leave because those are the 5 key judgments up front. And then a discussion of the big I versus big V. Big I is interests versus values, which has been a perennial discussion, by the way, for years. And it's coming back again in the context of what's happening in the region and the points that Mark alluded to. Then I want to talk about the changing geography of terrorism, and then ISIS, and then where to go from here. And so the key observations, basically, understanding ISIS or Daesh. Daesh is the term that's used in the Middle East, and I see more and more of our senior government officials use, especially John Kerry, using Daesh. Daesh is the Arabic abbreviation for ISIS. And understanding of that requires an awareness of how complex the issue is. The region, the issues we are talking about. It defies really these sound bites, whether political sound bites or breaking news CNN sound bites. It's much more complex and much deeper than that. Now, to understand that, of course, that means it requires expertise in the languages, the cultures, the history. And that's for all you students, those of you who are interested in pursuing a career in the government. I can tell you one factoid that is irrefutable. There is no substitute for expertise in whatever subject matter you are going to pursue. Economics, technology, political science, history, anthropology, languages, there is no substitute for expertise. That's what makes senior policymakers listen to you. And the third point I want to make is that these regional conflicts you hear frequently, oh, it's Sunni Shia, it's sectarian. It's much deeper than that. It's easy to say, well, it's Sunni versus Shia. Of course, these are elements and these are factors, but keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, because it's much more complex. And it's mostly like we see today, as we see today between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is over power struggle for power, struggle for control, less about doctrine. I mean, when the Saudis and the Iranians are talking about influence in the Gulf, they are not talking about Shia influence or Sunni influence. They're talking about Saudi influence. Of course, it represents the Sunni bloc. And in their mind, Iran represents the Shia bloc. But it's not only Sunni Shia as you hear in the news. And the next 2 points are basically about our relations in the region. You know, sometimes you hear whether it's Rand Paul or some other presidential candidate saying, well, we should leave the region and get out. This is rather simplistic. It's undoable. We have been intertwined with the region for 50, 60 years. It's not new. If you look at the map of the region, you find that every country that the United States military, the United States has a military presence either in every country of the region or next to every country in the region. And this is the greater Middle East from Turkey to Pakistan. So that's only on the national security level. We are, of course, involved in commerce. We are involved in, and this is the last point, which talks about our really the key interests in the regions. Okay, the first one is Israel. For years, we've been supportive of Israel and interested in its security. The other one is the commons that you don't talk much about. The commons are basically sea lanes of communication, air lanes of communication. You know, the Middle East has 3 of the world's top strategic waterways. The Strait of Hormuz between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. Bab el-Mandab between the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal. So these are 3 of the world's most strategic waterways. So that's one of our interests, the protection of those. Commerce, of course, started with oil, but it's much more than oil. Nuclear non-proliferation. And, of course, regional stability and security. These have been the traditional interests. What is, of course, happening is that you have to kind of take another look at these traditional interests, because now what we see is that the threats that are emerging, the gathering threats, if you will, emanate from non-state actors. Most of them, of course, we talk about Russia and Putin and China, those are still there. But most of the immediate threats, and for the next decade, emanate from non-state actors. Whether it's terrorist organizations or other non-state operations. Of course, you know, which is the worst. Today, a report that came out yesterday showing Boko Haram is more dangerous than ISIS. Well, unfortunately, the criterion is the number of deaths, of killings that they have done. So they are larger. Their number is larger than ISIS. But keep that in mind. You know, one is like in the 6,000 something and one in the low 6,000. And as Mark indicated when he referred to Assad, when you look at Syria, you find that most of the 250,000 people killed in Syria have been killed by the regime, but not by ISIS. A very interesting thing to keep in mind. So these threats are, in a sense, emanating from non-state actors. Now, in terms of status report, 5 years now on of the Arab Spring, mostly faded. Daesh violence and brutality, unfortunately, is moving from the local to the global. So is moving outside the Levant, the Sykes-Picot regime that was created in April 1916, 99 years ago, and first in the region and then beyond. In the region, they have always fought what we call the near enemy, and they are moving now to the far enemy. So they are moving from the Levant. I would imagine the trajectory to go toward Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and then at the same time causing havoc in other countries. So the situation in the Middle East, then, we see states that are imploding. Iraq, Yemen, Syria, there should be no end there in Syria. So imploding. We see a new bombing realignments to bomb ISIS in Syria. Russia, France, the US, Iran, Turkey. We don't know who is bombing whom and who is being killed by whom. It's really a free for all. And the pro-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda groups are being empowered. In some cases, ISIS is being empowered. And so you don't know who is bombing whom. And in fact, if you are a traffic cop for aircraft over Raqqa, the capital of ISIS, you would have a hell of a time just keeping those planes away from each other's way. And that's over one small little town that ISIS considers its capital. So these are new alignments that are developed. These are short-term alignments. I don't imagine us really creating a long-term alignment with Putin. The Saudi civil war in Yemen, from day one, I thought it was a useless, totally unnecessary war. It's teetering. The Saudis cannot wait for us to help them extricate themselves from Yemen. They have not reached their objectives that they indicated the first day they went to war. Yemen is less secure today than when the Saudis started. The rebels in Yemen, the Houthis, have not been defeated. The Saleh regime, who was removed, you see, that's a problem when you remove a dictator and you don't remove the regime. So the tentacles of that regime are still there. And Hadi Abu Drabbu, he keeps shuttling, this is the president of Yemen, keeps shuttling between Saudi Arabia and Aden, stays 2-3 days in Aden. It gets too dangerous, so they ship him back to Saudi Arabia. And I think it's better for his health if they build a wing for him in the pod in Saudi Arabia. You know, there's a big palace, I call it the pod. This is a palace of the deposed, pod, P-O-D. So any one deposed dictator has a wing there. So I think he should just sit there. Autocracy, unfortunately, is back in the saddle in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Saudi. And the massive refugee problem is not only in the region but in Europe. And of course, our policy in the region, to be very, very charitable without being critical, I think we need more certainty. There is lack of clarity, and we need more certainty about the interests that we are after and the values that we support. And this is the theme of this presentation, this balancing act between interests and values. So the 5 key judgments that I would make for this presentation, I put them up front so that to keep you kind of awake with me here. So the pursuit of the national interest in defense of security and of the security of this country and our citizens need not be inimical to America's democratic values. You know, what happened with the realist school, whether it's George Kennan or Hans J. Morgenthau or Kissinger, or to some degree Brzezinski, that realist school talked a lot about interests and very little about values. Yet every president When he gives a speech, he says, this is who we are. This phrase, who we are, even Secretary Clinton yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations used that phrase. I mean, and this is a good phrase. Who we are is our values. She said, we cannot turn our back on these refugees because of what we are and who we are. So unfortunately, for many of our students over the last 50 years in international relations, whether Mike or myself, when we went through school, to a large extent, we had to study the realist school in international relations, which means interest. It's fine because we have interest. But we kind of tended to, the balance shifted in favor of interest. And so I'm arguing that this is a false dichotomy, really. I raised it just for the purpose of this lecture as a straw man. But it's a false dichotomy, I would argue. That we can pursue our interests while at the same time be true to our values and pursue our values. If we think we are a great nation because of our values, which I believe, then why not export this, in addition to a few sophisticated weapons, export this idea to other countries and stand by it. And we have worked well with democracies. We don't like sometimes what democracies produce, right? Our presidency democracy is messy. Of course it is messy. And so sometimes we don't like the elections in some countries if they are fair and free elections and they produce the wrong result or produce a party that we don't like. Well, unfortunately, that's the game. If you believe in democracy, you have to work with what comes out of it. I mean, in the long run, it might not be good in the short run. In the long run, it's better. And that was the argument about Hamas, by the way, in 2006. We wanted elections in Palestine in 2006. The elections were held. We declared them fair and free. Our President Jimmy Carter declared them also fair and free because his group was monitoring the elections. Well, the result was Hamas. Well, of course, we might not like Hamas, but that was elected through elections, fair elections. And so there was a debate in the government in which I was involved, whether to give Hamas 6 months as a grace period and see how they do. We can always pull the rug from under them. And that for one day the president liked that argument, but by the end of the day he lost the argument. And the other argument won. Just pull the rug from under him. And till this very day, and this is what, from 2006 till today, that's 9 years, I firmly believe that that decision resulted in the 3 wars in Gaza. The 2 big wars and all the conflicts in between. 08, 09, and 12. I mean, these decisions have consequences. The decisions we made in Iraq to dissolve the Iraqi army and de-Ba'athify, those 2 decisions had a huge consequence and very major consequences for Iraq till this very day. So decisions have consequences. So this need not be inimical. The second point is that cuddling dictators and illiberal regimes might be good in the short term. They do our work for us. Mubarak, Musharraf, the 2 Abdullahs, everybody, they do our work for us. It's easier to deal with dictators. But in the long run, it doesn't work. In the long run, it's a losing proposition. And you saw what happened to Mubarak in Egypt, what happened to Saleh in Yemen, what happened to Ben Ali in Tunisia, and what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. So working with dictators might be good in the short term, but if we learn anything from history, it should be that cuddling dictators in the long run does not work. And the fourth point is that, as I said already, that this big I versus big V, is a false dichotomy. The emphasizing, as I said, who we are can help us. Not only emphasizing who we are, but pushing for it can help us achieve what we need. So what we are is the values, what we need are the interests, and the two can work together. And the final one is what's happening today in the Levant, is that unfortunately, so far, we have not come up with an alternative to the collapsing Levant that was created by the British and the French in 1916, creating those Levantine countries, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. ISIS has already declared the boundaries between Iraq and Syria finished, and more boundaries will be removed. Boko Haram is doing exactly the same thing in the Sahel countries. The boundaries that the French created in the Sahel countries, Niger, Chad, Mauritania, Mali, are not going to work for long. And unfortunately, is that while this is a fact, while everybody, there was a town hall meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations yesterday in New York, they all agreed that the Levant will never ever be the same. That Syria and Iraq will never emerge as unitary states. There was a disagreement in the meeting. I was on teleconferencing call 1 hour. There was disagreement about what would replace it. So, I mean, my plea is that we should really, while at the same time target ISIS, we should also look at the region that produced ISIS in the first place. So this scorecard, I wanted to give you examples of where the interests are in some of these, and where the values are. So these are selected examples about where we use our values to do that. So the June 4, 2009 Cairo speech was a beautiful speech. I was honored really and privileged to work with the speech writers, the president's speech writers on that speech that the president gave in Cairo. It represented our values. So that's an example of values. Engaging Islamic political parties on the basis of tolerance and inclusion. That's values. Closing Guantanamo. That's values. Supporting fair and free elections in Egypt, Palestine, Morocco, etc. Values. Criticizing human rights abuses. We have done all of that, you see. Supporting Arab Spring demands for justice, dignity, and democracy. It's values. Calling for inclusion and basically democratization is values. Now, the other side of the ledger, unfortunately, we also have examples of interests that we also have been pushing. Tolerating the Sisi coup in Egypt. Well, that's interest. The fact is we did not even want to call it a coup. We didn't call it a coup because of the law. Tolerating repression in Bahrain till this very day. We say, we use very nice statements, but in fact, repression in Bahrain continues. Tolerating repression in Saudi Arabia. Of course, for interest. Tolerating Saudi intervention in Bahrain. Tolerating Saudi war in Yemen. Tolerating continued Israeli occupation. Tolerating human rights abuses in Iran. Tolerating counter-revolution by Arab autocrats. All of these are interests. So you see, The problem for you, if you later on develop careers and go to State Department, we have a diplomat, our diplomat in residence, and Callahan here in the audience. If you go to State Department and you deal with policy, this is a major responsibility you will have. How do you balance interest and values? And it's not, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an academic exercise only. It's a real thing because it affects our position in these countries. I mean, the fact is today, Bahrain ignores us. I mean, Bahrain is a two-bit banana monarchy and doesn't listen to us at all when we admonish them about their repression. They say, well, you know, your interests are going to trump your values in here. And they are right. We wanted to appease the Gulfies. We wanted to appease the Saudis. We wanted to appease the Bahrainis. We wanted to appease the Emiratis because we wanted their support for the agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement with Iran. And the Saudis never forgave us for throwing Mubarak under the bus so precipitously after the Arab Spring. So the president has kind of taken a different position toward them for interest. And so these are examples of interest. So I wanted you to keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, as we go back now more into terrorism and ISIS. So before I go into ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on and terrorism in the region, I just want to, if you picture, those of you who know some geography, I don't know whether we teach geography anymore in high school and maps and so on, but those of you who know some geography, if you imagine the Middle East and Africa, you see how the geography of terrorism has changed. ISIS has played a very important role in this change. Not only ISIS, other groups as well, pro-Al-Qaeda groups, but ISIS has been very critical in changing the nature of terrorism in the Levant. So there's that line in the Levant, now in Sinai, and I expect it very soon to go into the heartland. You know, up till now it's been in Sinai, but you should not be surprised if within the next 6 to 12 months, terrorism goes into Egypt, if the regime continues along the same path. By the way, I am sorry, but I want to correct the record for reasons that some of you might understand. All of this lecture is based on recent articles that I wrote. And I say that for very specific reason, that those articles had already been approved by the PRB. This lecture is based on those articles. So the Arabian Peninsula, not just Yemen, but the other GCC states. Africa, across Africa, north, west, east, and the Sahel countries. I don't see much terrorism below the equator. Most of the terrorism we see in Africa, and I went to many of these countries, if not all of them. You see them, North Africa, one parallel, the Sahel, another parallel, and East and West Nigeria and Somalia. So keep that in mind. Now, ISIS's global reach, if it weren't really for the events in France and all these threats recently, basically ISIS up till very recently has been focusing on the Levant, on the region, on what we call the near enemy. That is, their regimes who tend to be Muslim but are un-Islamic in their behavior from their perspective. So they targeted those to establish a caliphate, because ISIS is very much interested in establishing and maintaining a caliphate. And some actually, one friend of mine who follows the issues said yesterday on television he thought probably it was a miscalculation on the part of of ISIS to target France, because that created a coalition, Western coalition, including Russia, against ISIS. Well, you know, my response to him, I called him and I said, the fact is, that's what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted to achieve. They wanted to achieve another crusader Western colonial war against Islam. That's what is, and I think sometimes we fell for it. And our reaction that we have to do all of these things, I mean, in a sense, that's what they are interested in, you see. But now what we see is that there has been an ideological expansion to like-minded groups in Africa and other places. So you see some groups in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen or Libya declaring bay'ah or allegiance to the caliphate. So their stretch is mostly started ideological, and that's what they are interested in. We might kill and defeat ISIS, but this idea of the caliphate is resonating among a lot of Muslims, especially in the Gulf. As a result of that, we see long-term stability is spreading also in the greater region. Again, keep that map in mind. Regional terrorist organizations are ascending while Al-Qaeda Central is on the wane, which is interesting. You know, it started terrorism after, before and since 9/11, Al-Qaeda type terrorism from Al-Qaeda Central was global. And then it began to devolve into regional groups. And then the regional groups began to evolve into global, and Al-Qaeda Central began to devolve into almost obscurity. I mean, you know, when was the last time you heard from Ayman Zawahiri, who is the head of Al-Qaeda? He's probably holed up in some place in Pakistan, on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And he's totally marginalized. The regional groups are more threatening. AQAP in Yemen, AQIM in the Maghreb, AQ in Iraq, and now of course ISIS. And then these separate groups in the Sahel country. The Morabitoun was the group that attacked the Radisson Hotel last night and held so many people hostage. It was a group, it's called Morabitoun. It comes from northern Chad, and it has association, actually started their affiliation with Al-Qaeda. So it's probably Al-Qaeda group that is doing that. In fact, after the terrorism in France, I was contacted and asked to write my analysis that evening without having any information, specific information. I said we should also consider the possibility that Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb could be involved in the terrorism in France, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This planning and sophistication and teams on the battlefield and theater, that's only within the purview, has been within the purview of Al-Qaeda and its groups. ISIS has not displayed this type of acumen and expertise before. And that's why I thought perhaps the three potential culprits were: one, ISIS; two, Al-Qaeda in North Africa because of the connection of North Africans in France; and three, local French citizens of North African origin. And in fact, in France and Belgium, second generation people, young people who were born and raised there, committed these acts. While, as I said, as long as ISIS appears to be winning, then volunteers, if you will, jihadists from Western countries will continue to fill its ranks. I will come to what to deal with ISIS, and which was the last point about containment versus defeat. Now, quickly, you heard Al-Qaeda from 9/11, and so just 4 or 5 comparison, 4 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points comparing Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They both have similar ideologies, millenarian. They both wanted to establish a caliphate, and they both needed a territory to establish a caliphate. Whereas Al-Qaeda failed in both, ISIS succeeded in achieving both. They achieved territory, they conquered territory, and they established the caliphate. So the caliphate in Islam has to be on a territory, on a piece of territory. It's not in somebody's head. Osama bin Laden could not occupy a territory or conquer a territory, and therefore he did not establish a caliphate. ISIS has succeeded in both. ISIS jihadists, which is for us more dangerous, they are more lethal, more experienced in sophisticated weapons, and they have been battlefield hardened. Many of Al-Qaeda jihadists did not have that experience. And the last point, what we see happen in France, if this was part of a trend which we don't know. Of course, they are issuing all kinds of propaganda, YouTube things that well, from Paris to Rome, so Rome is being threatened, and they are threatening Washington, and they are threatening New York, and I mean, it's a lot of these things are propaganda, of course. But if Paris is a unique event, then that's something else. If it is part of unfolding pattern, then that last point becomes very dangerous to me. Al-Qaeda moved from the global to the local. I had talked about ISIS 4 years ago, and I said ultimately it will go from the local to the global. And ISIS, if that is part of its pattern, then they have made the decision to go from the local to the global. Unlike Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda had to import their people to New York to fly those planes, ISIS seems to be depending on local people born and raised in the West with Western passports below the radar. That Abu Ud, can you imagine that guy who was just killed, who, according to the French, organized and was the mastermind behind the terrorism in France? I mean, went back and forth, I don't know how many times, between Belgium and France and Belgium and Syria, and was never on the radar. What happened to the Deuxième Bureau? What happened to their intelligence services? It's very hard for me to imagine. I mean, we have no more than half a dozen Americans who went to Syria and came back. Under half a dozen Americans. We are very fortunate. I'll come to that in the question and answer if you like, as to why we don't have the same problem. Now, in order to fight ISIS, of course, it's very important to know what drives it. I mean, ISIS was not the creation of somebody on Mars or Matt Damon on somewhere in his trips there. It was created on the ground. So what were the things that drove ISIS, brought it into being? Ideology, of course, is one. Radical, Salafi, Sunni ideology. Not Shia ideology, Sunni ideology. And the radical strain of that ideology. For the most part, in the last 50 years, This type of ideology has emanated from Saudi Arabia, our key ally in the Gulf, of course. So that ideology drives that group, gives meaning to the group. But then the domestic policies. So it's not a question of just, big, difficult rocket science to explain. It's real policies that have given rise to groups like ISIS. Al-Qaeda first. Dictatorship, corruption, repression, poverty, unemployment, underemployment, sectarianism. In Iraq, you say, why is ISIS supported by the Sunnis? Well, of course it's supported by the Sunnis. Because they have all kinds of grievances. They've been excluded from the regime after the demise of Saddam Hussein. And many of them, their professionals, have either left Iraq or are unemployed. And so they tend to give support to this type of group. Then there are the perceived anti-Islamic policies by Western countries. Now, the other day one was asking, how come ISIS is so resilient? What are the factors that contribute to its resiliency? Again, I looked at the literature, I looked at their statements, I looked at the policies. There are very few factors, and you can identify those factors, right? Well, the first factor is success. Ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing like success. Success breeds success. When they are successful, when they expand, then they tell their potential recruits, see, we are doing well. I mean, they went through most of Iraq, most of Syria, in very short term. And so success has been a factor. Brutality and obedience is another factor. If you go to Raqqa or the cities under their control, it's not Sunday school. I mean, they are very brutal. You can live, I talk to people who lived in those cities, you can live nicely if you don't oppose any of the governing institution. If you keep your mouth shut, you are safe. But once you say anything, not only you are killed, your family is killed, your house is destroyed, and you see brutality leads to obedience. And that's a factor. Another factor is resources and territory. This is very critical factor when we talk about how to fight ISIS. Because whether it's containment or defeat, the defeat and degrading, these are all really political words. I think the real term that we should focus on is containment. Because of this third factor. If you contain ISIS on the ground, that means their territory would shrink. If their territory shrinks, their resources would shrink. If their resources shrink, then their success would dim. If their success dims, their recruits would begin to dry up. I mean, it's Aristotelian logical structure, isn't it? So if we want to fight ISIS, we have to look at these factors. If resource and territory is the factor that keeps it going, then it makes sense to contain that territory and dry up those resources. The ideology, namely the caliphate, that's a very difficult thing to defeat. Let's be very honest and realistic about it. It's very difficult for us to fight their messaging online. They do messaging like bin Laden did much better than we do. We have spent a lot of money. I was involved in the messaging process in government, and then I got tired of it and stopped going to those meetings because it was a waste of time. We don't know how to do it. And that doesn't, this is nothing to criticize our government at all. You know, we view it from a different perspective altogether, a Western perspective, you see. And we think, well, they are crazy to believe in the caliphate. I mean, can you imagine some of our messages say, oh, these are crazy ideas. What do you mean the caliphate? The caliphate existed in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. You want to go back? Yeah. Some of them want to go back. And they believe in it. So we have to kind of accept that as point of departure if we want to do our messaging. And the final thing is that their millenarian struggle is part of their ideology. That they view this struggle, millenarian, in terms of years and years and years, against the near enemy and the far enemy. And that's not going to stop, you see. So we have to be prepared for that, rather than just be very nice and say, well, you see, gee, let me tell you the truth about the caliphate. Or let me tell you what the Quran says. Unless you are a specialist, an expert in the Quran, don't go there. Don't get involved in religious debates about which you know very little. And that doesn't work, you see. And it hasn't worked. And this is why I say, when it comes to ideology, so the third factor is where we can come in. There's another factor where we can come in about our local people. That's a separate story. I'll talk about that. But in fighting ISIS, that third factor is critical. Forget about the other two. Forget about ideology. Forget about the caliphate. Now, having talked about ISIS, now let me just also mention something that I already mentioned. That, and I want to emphasize that ISIS is not the only threat, is not the only danger, is not the only factor of instability in the region. And you know what? This is where we have to combine our interests with our values. When we talk about ending repression, it's not only good for our moral sensibilities, it's also good for our interests. I mean, I am prepared to argue that our interests can be served better in the long run if those people in those countries are free. Free peoples are better partners in the long run than dictators. Why? Free peoples can create, can innovate, can create jobs, can pursue education that they think is important, education that can give them jobs. Free people can speak their minds. Free people can ultimately generate Nobel laureates. Why is it that so many scholars, students who come from the Middle East and from Africa and Muslim countries come to this country or to Europe, succeed, and some of them become Nobel laureates, and not one, probably one, Naguib Mahfouz, a literary figure in Egypt, got the Nobel laureate? Those who got Nobel laureates in science, in chemistry, in physics, in medicine, they did not get it in those countries. They got it in this country, and in England, and in European countries, you see. So free people can be creative people. In the long run, creative people are better for our interests, not just our values. And so this is why we need to look at these and say, okay, these are the real issues. Now, environmental degradation, you might think, oh, where did this come from? Well, of course it's important. When you talk about food and water and energy, lack of security in those areas, that's environmental degradation. Yemen might be the first Middle East country to go dry. They don't have fresh water to drink. And when we see these economic refugees coming to this, not to this country, but to Europe, and we call them economic refugees, well, if they had good education and good jobs in their countries, they would not leave those countries. En masse, I mean, in hundreds of thousands. They are coming to countries where there are jobs, where there is better life, where they can walk freely. But we had a person who came from Bahrain to seek asylum, political asylum, in this country, and his observation after the first month or two in this country, he was driving, walking around, and he told me, he says, I did not see any police stopping me on the way. I said, you better not speed. If you speed, they'll stop you. Otherwise, they'll leave you alone. He says, I did not have any security forces stopping me and asking me for my ID card. He doesn't have New Mexico driver's license. But you see, the point is, this is the type of freedom that they want. And if they live free there, they don't have to bother us here. And we really need to look, I mean, the refugee problem, the refugee crisis, is a real crisis, is a wake-up call, not about refugees, unlike what some politicians are saying. This country is based on refugees. It's based on immigrants. But it is a wake-up call about addressing those issues that have given rise to the refugee problem in the first place. They are the same issues, by the way, that have given rise to ISIS in the same place. In the first place. Now, I've talked a lot, so I want to go to the way forward. And so, very few points I want to make. So, tomorrow, what should we do? So I said, okay, ISIS must and can be contained. I put can, I should have put it in red, can be contained. And I think that's where the focus should be. 2, we need to address those other factors that gave rise to ISIS in the first place. Because if we defeat ISIS today, if ISIS is kicked out of Syria and Iraq, and the same conditions prevail, I can guarantee you that within 5 years we'll have another terrorist organization. It might not be the same name, but we will have one because of those conditions. The third is that balancing our interests and values is very critical for this country, for, please forgive the phrase, who we are and what we are. It's very critical. And it's not either or. If people say, well, you know, we should bomb him and leave, well, yeah, what does that do? In the long run, our stature and prestige and credibility in the region doesn't come just from the power of arms, and we are the most armed nation in the world. It comes from the strength of these values. That's what gives the United States and other democracies their credibility. So this balancing is critical. The fourth point, all of you know it by now, that military responses have not been sufficient. There has to be different, especially when I talk about military responses, I'm talking about the air campaign. The other point, the points that the demands of freedom, democracy, and dignity in the Arab world today remain very powerful. Nobody wants to talk about the Arab Spring, the phrase, anymore there. But they still talk about freedom, democracy, and dignity. Whether in Bahrain, or in Egypt, or in Jordan, or in Morocco. U.S. support is critical. I mean, regardless of what we say, regardless of what they say, the United States is the person to go to. If there's a problem, who do you call? The United States. We still have lines and lines of people near our consulates all over the world wanting visas to come to this country. They might not like our policy, but you know what? They love education, American education. They love American technology. They love American freedom. And that's real. And so the final point, the urgent point I want to make is we need to focus on the Levant beyond ISIS. It's not enough. You know, have you seen Charlie Wilson's War? Was that movie? Tom Hanks did that in Afghanistan. You know, at the end, and I know that a Greek fellow who was talking with the congressman, he worked at the agency, a real person who really looked like him, by the way, looked like that actor. But you know what Charlie Wilson said at the end? He said, okay, so we defeated the Russians got out of there, so now we need to invest $1 billion in schools. He said, schools and factories. And the congressman told him, oh, well, okay, that's for another day. They totally ignored it. And he said, if we don't, there'll be another chaos in in Afghanistan. And that happened 10 years later. And the same thing in the Levant. The Levant has been destroyed, but if we are only going to go and defeat ISIS, contain it, defeat it, and go home, then what did we leave behind? The same conditions that were there before ISIS came to be. Now, in when I was at the agency, every time one of my analysts would write a piece for the PDB or other things, I always tell him I want wild cards at the end. What kind of wild cards do you imagine? Wild cards are things that have low probability of happening, but very high impact should they happen. I consider it up to 10%. Might not happen tomorrow, but if it happened, what kind of wild cards could happen that might alter your judgment? Or I would ask the analyst, what is it you don't know now that if you knew this thing that you don't know, how would your judgment be altered? And that's always good to kind of review your analysis and your judgments in light of what could happen. So there is a list of these wild cards. And this, by the way, not just alter, but would challenge our balancing act between the big I and the big V, interest versus values. And so the first thing is a military coup or a popular revolution in Egypt. Perhaps a military coup, I should really raise it more than 10%. And probably over the next year, I would give it 15% instead of, or 20%. Because it already happened in the summer. 26 officers were arrested and tried for plotting against the regime. A popular revolution could still occur. The economy has tanked. Sisi has not improved personal security. You could, under Mubarak days, you could go out in the street and feel safe. Today you cannot. So it is possible. Precipitous containment or defeat of ISIS without U.S. help. You would say, well, it's good it's defeated, and I agree, but if it's done without our help, perhaps that will undercut U.S. influence and posture in the region. Then two-bit dictatorships and monarchies would just laugh us off. Now they ignore us, they'll begin to kind of laugh us off, you see. Precipitous collapse of the Assad regime. That's a quick one. And then people would scramble around as to what would happen and what group will take over. Removal of King Salman of Saudi Arabia. There is a disagreement within the ruling family, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, already in the news. There were letters sent out publicly criticizing the king and his son. If the family decides to remove him and replace him with another one who will go back to a more quietist diplomacy, then that will change the calculus of our interests and values in the Gulf. A Saudi-Iranian war that is sectarian, an eruption of sectarian wars on a huge scale, that also would change the calculus, because you have a number of countries. Even though you have 3 countries with Shia majority, Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, but you have a lot of other Sunni countries with Shia minorities. In Kuwait is almost 30%, in Azerbaijan is almost 40%, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen. So you have countries with Shia minorities. And if there is a sectarian war, then these Shia minorities will begin to erupt against those regimes. A Palestinian intifada, a bloody one, that also could alter the calculus, because if it is a bloody, massive intifada, and if the Israeli reaction is equally massive, the Arab world cannot just stand still and not do something about it. So potentially, we might have that type of conflict, and could lead to ISIS coming back into the region, not just in Sinai and Egypt, but into Gaza and inside Israel as well. So Israel will be involved again in the ISIS. So far has avoided this ISIS conflict. But if there's an intifada and there's war, then ISIS and other terrorist organizations might enter the fray. Well, on this happy note, of course, I will stop and open the floor to discussion, questions and answers. Thank you.
So, Emile, I'll let you handle all the questioning and answer directly, but I'll ask the first question.
Please.
Given that really exciting list of wildcards, I noticed that none of the potential wildcards were opportunities for movement toward democracy in any countries in the region. Are there any opportunities of movement toward democracy, and what can the United States or the international community do to promote that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a great question, and that's really what is bedeviling the region, is that for the most part, the opportunity for democratization and for transitioning to democracy really was the Arab Spring. And it's like the United States supported it so well, so strongly. And I thought, frankly, we were, and I wrote a piece on it, and I thought we were witnessing the rise of a new Obama doctrine regarding the Arab Spring. And that doctrine was simple. And the president made it very clear when he opposed Mubarak and opposed those other regimes. And the doctrine was, we support a ruler, dictator or whatever, we support a ruler as long as his people support it. But if his people stand up, rise up against him, we can no longer support him. That was basically the underlying argument behind the president's support of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, very quickly right after that, what we discovered is that leaders were deposed, but their regimes stayed in power. And we were satisfied with the deposing of persons, but we did not say a word about the regime that stayed in power. So in every case, the regime began to work to re-establish itself, perhaps under a different person. So Sisi is really the face of the previous regime, right? Even though he talked about a partnership between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood in his thesis, which he wrote at the War College in Carlisle in 2006. And at the time, he thought that 16, 17-page thesis, he thought that was very revolutionary. And he told the War College, please don't let my government see it, because I'll get in trouble. So he went back and was appointed by Morsi as the head of the military and began to conspire against Morsi from day one. So the fact is the Arab Spring really was the only promise of democratic transitions. And that list, you are absolutely correct, is that for the most part is really a negative list. Now, what can we do? The United States is very critical. We need to move a bit once we realize that these dictators are not really necessarily serving our interests. And we will come to that day. I mean, the Saudis are talking to the Russians and the Chinese, and Sisi is talking to the Russians and the Chinese. But the fact is that once we realize that Sisi is not being able to establish stability in Egypt without including the Muslim Brotherhood, we are going to come back to that point. So the United States, once we go beyond this, unfortunately, this sad period of the violence and terrorism in France, we are going to realize that Egypt, which is the largest Arab country, is not really managing itself. There is no domestic stability. There is no domestic security. And the reason is that most of the people are out, are not included. And so we would come back and say, well, it makes a lot of sense to include your people in elections. I mean, the last election in Egypt was a farce, right? It has the lowest percentage turnout in the history of Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood did not participate, and it was a kind of a sham, really, a sham election. And the old regime people won, basically. And so these elections are not... So I think in the end, if we begin to move slowly toward values, and not just because of moral sensibilities, although they are very important, but because of the belief that values ultimately will help our interests, then that will be, the right path, I think. Might not be in my lifetime, but yes, Marina.
Thank you very much for another excellent presentation.
Thank you.
It seems that over the last year, the situation with terrorism is deteriorating, although there is so much going into containment of terrorism. Can you comment on what are the reasons why it's becoming worse? I have another question, though, too. It seems also that the age of terrorists, they are becoming younger and younger. What happened in Paris was done by 20-year-olds. So if this is the trend, don't you think there should be some kind of counterbalancing towards that, some policies targeting the younger terrorists? And the final one that I should not ask, but still went to, is what is your gut feeling? Was Paris a unique event, or is it a trend? It was also so successful. The reason I'm asking is that there might be some copying just because it was so successful. Sorry for that many questions.
Thank you, Marina. It's just the first question. I did not get the first question. Why terrorism is what?
Why the situation, deteriorating?
Well, I mean, okay, it's really very. When you look at that list and the continued entrenched dictatorships in these countries, continued repression, unemployment. I mean, in the last 2 years, I've been focusing more on entrepreneurship. And I really believe that in the end, unless you create initiatives that have job creation in them, it's not going to work. right? When you look at the 15 to 29 age cohort group in every Muslim country, every Muslim minority country, all over the Middle East, you find that unemployment ranges from the most optimistic 25% to the most pessimistic and realistic figure of almost 65%. So when you are talking about 65%, whether you are talking about Gaza, Yemen, Egypt, and so on, anywhere from the 50 to 60% unemployed, these young men, not only they are only unemployed like they are here, they can't go to the unemployment office like they do here and get some money for a few weeks. They have to stay home. They have to rely on their parents to support them. They cannot get married. They cannot elope. They have to have money to get married. They cannot get a house. And so they become very frustrated. I mean, that's one element of frustration. I am not arguing at all that there is a linear relationship between unemployment and terrorism. But there is a relationship between unemployment and alienation and anger and frustration. All those combined begin to contribute to that. Now, the second point was about the reasons you said why your question was the second part. The third part was about the younger generation.
No, the second part was about the younger generation.
Yeah, well, the fact is, you know, when Al-Qaeda started, they had young people too. I mean, we had unfortunately, some of the youngest people at Guantanamo. We had some minors at Guantanamo. And there were many high school kids in Afghanistan. Many. I mean, I interviewed one from Saudi who just barely graduated from high school before 9/11 and was arrested fleeing Afghanistan in 2011. And when I asked him, you know, how did he discover God in high school? He said, hell no. So I said, what did you do in high school? He said he drank and chased women. And then out of high school, no job, started going to the next neighborhood mosque. And within 2 months, he found himself in Peshawar and Pakistan and then in Afghanistan. What is happening today is that many of these young men and women who are savvy in social media, they do no longer need a person, a radical imam somewhere to recruit them or radicalize them. They can self-radicalize online at a younger age. The fact is, my grandson knows more about computers than I will ever know. So the younger the generation, the more knowledgeable they are with social media. And it's amazing what the French told us about that was the second point, about what happened in France. That they're planning, these three teams that they were planning the terrorism, were using social media and websites that were so difficult to break that our own FBI, certainly the French, could not break. So they were communicating using all kinds of creative things. That lends to younger people, the technology of it. Of course, they still listen to some old guys preaching somewhere, but they don't anymore. They don't. Unlike the Al-Qaeda days, they don't even go and seek the approval or a fatwa, an edict, religious edict, from an imam to justify their action. They just do it. And they learned from the Israeli days, they no longer call their mom on their cell phone right before they commit the act, Mom, I love you, well, I'll see you in heaven. Well, the Israelis picked up on every one of those phones. You see, they don't do that anymore. They know how to plan, and that knowledge is because of technology and their familiarity with technology. And the third point is that these young people, some of them in charge of technology, come from the West. So they're familiar with technology. They recruit, not from this country, but mostly from Europe. They're familiar with it. Now, the second question you raised was the point I made, which was a question I raised, and that is Paris a discrete event, ETA, separate event, or is it part of a trend? We really don't know. It could be, and don't make the judgment based on these YouTubes that they are sending out. A lot of it is propaganda to spread fear in Western societies. But I think I tend to believe that over the next 6 months, they might be moving in that direction if they are contained more. The more they are contained, the more they are going to spread out. And so then Paris might be part of a trend rather than a discrete act, ETE. Ma'am.
Thank you so much for your presentation. But I noticed with your wild cards, I had another question about another possible wild card.
Yeah.
After the attacks in France and with across the entire Western world, there's been a very strong pattern of Islamophobia, to be sure. Whether it's Christian-oriented in such like Hungary, like a anti-culture war, which is also adopted by the United States, which has caused not only the House to attempt to change the refugee program through red tape, but also specifically in France, there's been a rise in the National Front Party of Marine Le Pen. And so after the attacks in France and a possible a boost in Marine Le Pen's not only popularity but understanding of her message, if she was to come to power and to the largest point of her platform is to dismantle the EU so that they no longer have to accept the EU's supra order to take in refugees, and also promoting Islamophobia, how would that also become a wild card affecting the region?
Unfortunately, it's not a wild card. I didn't include it because it's already happening.
Okay.
And so when something is happening, you don't think of it as 5 to 10% or under 10%. Unfortunately, this is a real problem that you are raising. And that started already before Paris. And it started with the refugees. And so what I expect to happen in Europe is that they are going to tighten that Schengen agreement, to tighten the travel between countries. They might establish all kinds of things about that. Islamophobia developed after 9/11. It kind of plateaued since then. After 9/11 in this country, but then picked up in Europe because of the refugees. And also because of so many of their people, young people going to do jihad. I mean, and that's an issue, I think Marina alluded to that. What do we do with our potential problematic kids at home? And I wrote about that in another piece, and that is, we should reach out to communities and engage communities. Luckily for the United States, we do not have an Islamic problem that Europe has. Our Muslim community, like every other immigrant community, participated in the economic life of the country and have done very well. And so we don't have ghettos here, Muslim ghettos. We might have ghettos used to in big cities for poor and blacks and Hispanics, but we don't have ghettos, specifically religious ghettos, and or immigrant ghettos like around Paris or around in the UK. And so the discrimination, I mean, my wife has a friend, an older person in Paris, and she called her right after the event. And that lady, and she is 88 years old, and she said, what our government needs to know, and the world needs to know, is that France is 2 countries. the city on the hill and the city below. And the city below, she said, you have no idea, and she is a Catholic nun, you have no idea about the discrimination and the alienation of the Muslim community in France. And she said, this is what really gives rise to these things. So in this country, I think our law enforcement services, the FBI and others, have reached more to Muslim communities. And so Muslim communities feel part of society and not alienated from society, as you find in a number of European countries. I mean, the Germans brought in the Turks back in the 40s, early 50s. And you still find Turkish ghettos. You still find examples of Turkish successful German Turks who were born and raised there. And in fact, we now have the first Turkish woman member of the Bundestag. Right? But for the most part, not. For the most part, they have not engaged their people, their immigrants. Whereas in this country, you don't have. I mean, you find in every walk of life, in every field of endeavor, you find Muslims there. From Fortune 500 to space science to Hollywood.
Well, we also have presidential candidates claiming that, like...
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm not going to go there. Sir, Steve.
With the emphasis on the radical Sunni form of ideology being a major source of the immediate problems, does that mean the U.S. should be more supporting Shia nations and regimes?
No, you know, it's a long history for Saudi Arabia in this type of ideology. Just a quick history. Saudi Arabia has had that ideology for centuries, right? And nobody cared about it. It was within Arabia, in the Arabian desert. It was developed by one very narrow school of Islamic jurisprudence in Sunni Islam, the Hanbali school. But then in the late 60s, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia decided that exporting Islam should be a cardinal principle of Saudi foreign policy. All right? And nobody paid much attention to that. Right? That was in 66. And then the oil crisis occurred in 72 and the price of oil shot up, right? So then they had the money to do that. And that time, exporting Islam was not really against the United States or against Christianity. It was the two enemies that King Faisal thought of were Arab nationalism under Nasser and communism. Those were the two reasons why he thought Islam should really neutralize him, right? And so they began to develop these Islamic NGOs, right? The OIC, the International Islamic Relief Organization, IIRO, the Muslim Youth, WAMI, World Assembly of Muslim Youth, Al-Haramain, and things of that sort. And they began to spread that Islam. Well, the Islam they spread was that radical ideology. That's the Islam they know of. Basically, inward-looking, intolerant of any human rights, civil rights, women's rights, minority rights. And so their view of those who don't follow that school of thought are basically either apostates or unbelievers. So your question then, should we support Shia? No, but I think what we should do is not get involved in that debate except to tell Saudi Arabia that they should teach a different kind of in their schools in addition to their religion. And we did that and then we backed off. We did that because when I was in the government, there were some studies that are still classified about textbooks in some of these countries, including in Saudi Arabia. And what the textbooks write is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Whether it's a family unit where it shows a picture of the man sitting in there reading the newspaper and the women barefoot and pregnant and in the kitchen. and the women controlled by the men, no rights, no nothing. And their views about other countries and about other religions. And so our diplomats thought that was a great study, and I still think it was a great study because I know who wrote it. And so then they went to Saudi Arabia. And our diplomats thought that was great because it was what we called actionable intelligence. It was something that you write that you can do something about, right? So they went to the Saudis, and the Saudi reaction was, okay, in the beginning they were nice. Oh, inshallah, we look at it. God willing, we look at it, you see. And inshallah, we'll do that. And then later said, what do you mean you are telling us how to teach our religion? And our diplomats immediately backed off. No, we are not telling you how to teach your religion. We are telling you that these ideas that you teach your high school kids are carrying them all the way to Afghanistan. They are carrying them to Chechnya. They are carrying them everywhere. And so you have to take another look at it. And so their only response later was Mohammed bin Nayef, who is now the crown prince, and said, okay, we start a de-radicalization program. De-radicalization is that this is like moving the ocean in a thimbleful or whatever, but in a bucket. I mean, you can't do that. And that country could afford de-radicalization, other countries can't. Because when they give each guy who goes through that de-radicalization school and is given $1 million, to get married and buy a house and have a car, well, how many countries can afford to give $1 million to each one who potentially can be de-radicalized? And so, but I think we have to have, I keep saying this two-ton elephant in the room is Saudi Arabia. We need to begin a serious conversation with Saudi Arabia about this type of ideology that they are spreading out. And it's not now that they are immune from this threat because it's coming home to roost, you see. And they attack Saudi Arabia, and they are after Saudi Arabia. Ma'am in the back.
I want to thank you too for your presentation. It's great to listen to you. I have one comment and one question. One comment is about, I'm from Germany, so the refugees are of course in my mind. I think the problem is different in the United States and in Europe. We have Muslim population. It's cheap labor, like we have cheap labor population from the Latin Americas here. So I think that's why, the class difference is different, and that's why we have so many more in proportion. So that's why we have probably more problems, and maybe more understanding for Muslim, because we all know Muslims. I think there might be racism, but anyway. My question is, you said poverty is one of the causes, which is of course quite clear for the ISIS uprising, one of the causes. So my question to you is, do you see a cause that is set in the United States, our hunger for resources and oil that causes all that, and what can we do about that?
So basically what you are saying is that our economic interest, particularly in the field of energy, might keep us focusing on...
Cheap labor too.
Yeah. It's not because the energy picture has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. The United States is no longer as dependent on Saudi oil as we were before. There are other countries dependent on Saudi oil. But we do export weapons and arms and all kinds of consumer products. So their commerce has changed, whereas oil from the 70s all the way to the first decade of this century, the end of last century, was about oil. It has changed dramatically. In this country, that is. Other countries still rely, like China and India, on Gulf oil. And once an agreement, the Iran nuclear agreement is put in place and the sanctions are lifted and a new rapprochement with Iran occurs and commerce begins to develop with Iran, then their oil production would go up. And they will not be limited or restricted by the limits that OPEC has on the books. And in fact, their oil minister just yesterday said we are not going to be limited by the limits that OPEC has put. So their production is going to go up. So in a sense, the more Iran, the more it's incorporated in the international system, the less important Saudi Arabia will become, you see. And cheap labor, unfortunately, is an issue in many industrial countries. If not here, might be in other countries. That's why so many corporations have taken their work to other countries where labor is much cheaper. In Australia, they can't afford, things have become so expensive because they can't afford their own labor to collect the produce. So they have to import oranges from California, and because their labor that gets paid minimum $15 an hour, minimum wage, the farmers cannot afford that type of labor. And so their agriculture is really going down the drain because of labor only.
A question about your point on resources, that we have to destroy the resources of ISIS. And I saw when we now started a policy of bombing their oil convoys. But my question is, who was buying that oil? Who's buying the ISIS oil?
It's mostly illicit trade, illicit. The bombing the other day, for the first time, we bombed a convoy of over 100 trucks and destroyed. This were mainly carrying oil. And illicit through Turkey, through Syria, through Iraq, through Azerbaijan. You know, if you have a commodity that people want to have, you can always find ways to get it there. It's like the same thing with weapons. How do they get these weapons? Okay, some from military installations that they overrun. Some they buy under this in the black market, by some Iraqi officers, by the way. And so they find ways, but the resources, unless the resources begin to shrink and their territory begins to shrink, those two are, to me, very critical in containing ISIS. Otherwise, talking about the caliphate, talking about ideology, talking about this and that is not going to lead anywhere, really. Sir, Richard.
It seems to me that in the U.S., the crucial debate right now is about military power. And I'm very skeptical that there's any strategy for increased military intervention that's not going to make the situation worse and pull the U.S. more deeply into future military interventions.
And I think that's the president's view too. And I support the president's view on this, and that is very, very hesitant to commit boots on the ground. I mean, we have few special forces and so on, but I think his view is a long-term view, and I'm in a sense I'm glad he is in the second term. Perhaps the first term would be politically incorrect to take that view, but his view is correct that in the end. Putting troops, and I worried the other day when we lost the sergeant there, our first casualty in Iraq. Because the more bodies we'll begin to see come to Dover, Delaware, the more we begin to think this is another Afghanistan, another Iraq. And the president is very aware of this, because that is not going to help the situation. It's not necessarily going to defeat ISIS's ideology. They might kill few people, but in the end, those factors, and in the end, they are going to say, see, the United States is joining the Crusaders' war against us. So I think that view is and the New York Times in their editorial supported the president's view, even though politicians, for all kinds of reasons, especially you find some at the top, but some who are 1%, 2%, 4%, they want to make a name, and so they come up with these crazy ideas. The fact is they should learn the lesson from Iraq, and they should learn a lesson from Afghanistan. The Taliban today is not really, I know I'm going on a limb, is not much weaker today. The fact that they took Kunduz the other day in such a short time shows me that they can operate, they can wage operations, they can plan for operations with fewer soldiers, fighters. And the Afghan army is helpless, it seems to me. Of course, they took Kunduz back, but the Taliban is not that much weaker, if at all, than it was 11 years ago. I mean, they lost power, of course, after 9/11, because we invaded them and we removed them from power. But they didn't. The other parts of the country that gave rise to the Taliban in the first place continues to be there. Those other factors continue to be there. And the same thing in the Middle East, unfortunately. Ma'am.
One last question, because I'm not
Oh my gosh, yeah.
actually taking up from how Marx started, with the wild cards being maybe also optimistic. For instance, the sense of values, exporting our values or working with them. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the agency of the different countries, because it's not only one working, it's working with them when they are also trying to create these values.
Yeah.
And I would even want to use the term radicalization in a positive sense, as in working for sustainability, working for gay rights, and so on, using the system to do it. So I want to hear a little bit about dialogue with these countries as opposed to telling them.
No, we don't tell them. We have been working actually. And after the Arab Spring, we started before and we continue with civil society institutions. And civil society institutions really is the only way that this engagement can be successful. The problem is that under Mubarak, for example, civil society institution was much more alive than it is today under Sisi. You know, these countries, even Bahrain, they passed recent laws saying that any civil society institution, organization that receives money from outside is suspect and it's illegal. Well, they can't operate if they don't get grants. I mean, that includes grants, not just outright money. Grants like the Ford Foundation and all kinds of granting foundations that offer grants to work even in non-political areas, in health, in mental health, in hygiene, in child rearing, and in areas that you need the community to work. And State Department and AID has done a good job at that, but not enough, because those regimes are even banning their civil society organizations. We used to work, our Department of Justice and lawyers used to work with their civil society to create some aspects of the rule of law, right? To work with them, to teach them. And we had courses and until their regime said, nope, I said, they are receiving aid from outside, they are illegal. And so in Egypt used to be a rich civil society country. Jordan still works because they have not banned civil society. So we work with civil society in Jordan. We work with civil society in Morocco. We work, of course, with civil society in Lebanon. But Iraq is imploding, Yemen is imploding, Libya is imploding, Syria is imploding, and the Gulf, they don't want civil society, because civil society means begin to question family rule, and they don't want that, you see. We worked with some civil society in Oman. We worked with some civil society in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. Pakistan is much harder. But basically, civil society that used to be the other partner, right, is constricted now.
Thank you.
Thank you.